Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. This time I'd like to talk to you about government contracts and grants. Really, when we look at this, there's three types of models that explain the relationship between nonprofit organizations and the government. When we talk about a grant, we're really talking about a gift of money. And I'll talk about the details as we go. The first model is the supplementary to government model. And this is just describing a situation in which nonprofits are providing public goods and services to fill gaps that are left by government programs and services that can't take these things on, that either aren't allowed to do them, they don't have a mandate, or they simply don't have the budget. Or maybe society hasn't pushed hard enough for them to get involved. And then we have the complementary to government model. This is about nonprofits working closely with government, using government funds, and working somewhat in a partnership. This is really about getting a grant from the government or some sort of contract or providing goods and services that you get reimbursed, maybe from your client and also then later from the government in some sort of arrangement. And then we have the adversaries of government model, which is really about nonprofits that are pursuing an idea or a cause of some type. And the nonprofits in this particular case may oppose current government policies. And in fact, that their purpose and their mission is to advocate for some type of governmental change. So really what we focus on in our discussions is the complementary to government model, where nonprofits are working with government. Sometimes they are receiving grants, sometimes they're not, but there is an arrangement with certain social programs and so forth to reimburse nonprofit for work that they do in providing goods and services for the public. So nonprofits do get some revenue from government funds, and government funds are generally considered public sources. And so I have some information for you based on figures from 2010. We could say that about a third of nonprofit revenue overall has come from public services. And that probably hasn't changed much in the last 10 years. When we look at these different sources from the government, what is this money? Well, about 9% is going into grants. So 9% of that public source money is the government giving out a grant of some type. About a fourth of it, about not quite 25%, is in payments for goods and services. And so this is most likely for what we would see in particular for healthcare services and programs like Medicare and Medicaid and so forth. And indeed, those are the main ones to really mention. When it comes to hospitals and other nonprofits that are healthcare institutions and so forth, they do receive the largest portion of these public source funds, in other words, government money. And it's under reimbursement through the Medicare and Medicaid programs themselves. And so clients come in, healthcare services offer them services and sometimes goods that they need. And then they are billed, and insurance works it out partly, and that's what Medicaid and Medicare are. They're insurance with the government, basically. And reimbursement happens. It becomes a source of revenue for these nonprofits. And then we also have the human service organizations. And now for these organizations, this government funding is much more essential. It represents about 2/3 of the money that they get. So government payments figure quite heavily in government service organizations. You can see here from this graphic where the revenue is really what categories. So fees for services and goods from the government, about a fourth, not quite. But fees for services and goods, about half of it is coming from private sources, not public money. And so this would be a variety of things, everything from donations to charity to larger contributions. You can see there private contributions. almost 13%. Government grants, again, about 9% or so. And then there is some investment in some of our larger and even in some of the smaller nonprofit organizations, 3.5% to 4% or so, and then just some other income that flows into the sector. This could be from a variety of sources, revenue producing events and so forth that nonprofit organizations might engage in and put together. Well, when we look at somewhat of the development of the nonprofit organization as we see it today, and the support that, in fact, the sector has received, it has been changing over time. It's been developing. And so we see that first in the 1960s, the introduction of the first really large-scale social programs, the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid. We also saw, though, at the same time, major federal student loan aid programs, and we saw some, for the, maybe not the first time, but for the first time in a very large way, national endowments for the arts and humanities, which hadn't really been a recipient in that particular area of government funds in the past. So the 1960s, when we can really look at it as a time when there was an awakening, a sense that there is money to be put into these worthy causes. In the 1970s, we started seeing different types of programs, the introduction of drug and alcohol treatment programs, for example, and also other sorts of nonprofit efforts based on basic situations that were happening in society. So we saw the rise of many domestic violence shelters and then shelters as well for runaway youth. We saw the emergence of rape crisis programs and suicide prevention programs and things like that. And then we saw this further development into the 80s with the development of large block grants to certain nonprofits who could qualify with the requirements that the government was asking for in mission and accomplishment, a level of clients served, and so forth. And we did see that states greatly expanded their spending, some of it relying on money that was coming through these government programs. In fact, states would also administer some of these programs. So we talk about grants and contracts and fees and so forth. Well, grants have a lot of interesting provisions to them. They are government funding that is made directly to an organization. They don't necessarily get the entire amount that was agreed upon in the grant in one lump sum. In fact, the government may decide to do it and disperse the funds in a number of different ways. It could give out a lump sum, but generally we find that it might be a semi-annual disbursement of funds. It could be quarterly. It will all be worked out in the contractual details of the grant itself and the recipient. So it's not necessarily that if you qualify for a certain grant, you're going to find that all of a sudden that entire amount appears in your nonprofit bank account. Also, these grants require the nonprofit to actually do specific services, provide the services or specific goods to either the government directly or its agencies, or operate for the agency, or exactly directly to citizens themselves. But there will be an agreement and it will be spelled out in all the details. So the government does require you to do certain things to get the money. So it may be paid upfront or it may be paid in installments. It is a legal contract when you get a grant. You agree to do certain things that are the provisions of the contract that are spelled out in the grant itself as what you agree to. So it's a legal agreement. The recipient is legally obligated to provide the goods and services and to get the defined results that you, again, have agreed to. If you fail to provide the services or goods that you have agreed to in the contract, that could be a breach of contract. You could go to court over it. You could be fined. There could be some really serious consequences. So the government also reserves the right to change the terms of the contract at any time. they can simply do that. Normally, you would negotiate contracts naturally. If it was something really complicated, your lawyers would negotiate all the details. But when it comes to a grant, it's a legally binding contract, and the government reserves the right to change the details at any time. They reserve the right to terminate the grant at any time. And they reserve the right to check on you and make sure you're fulfilling your part of the agreement. And so that would certainly involve a breach of contract. And so they will check and make sure you're doing what you said you would do. There could be some fees involved. The nonprofit would be eligible, depending on the circumstances of the grant, to charge fees. And they could either bill the clients that run through then a program like Medicare or Medicaid or a student aid grant or something like that. And third parties could become involved in the administration of these funds and the collection of the funds and so forth. But some fees are going to change hands. And so revenue does result from working with these opportunities to get a grant or a contract and so forth. You can expect that there'll be some arrangement where the fees are spelled out and handled. So here are the real details. And this is a great summary graphic here, this short table. You can see under contract, just like I've been saying, it's a binding agreement. You provide goods and services in return for some consideration. It's a grant, so it's money. It's inflexible. When you say you will agree to those terms, you don't get to renegotiate. You have to do exactly what you've agreed to. So the government expects delivery of results, product or performance, just like it says here. And so the payment, and in fact, they may give you some payment up front if they've never given you a grant before, and historically this was true. They would be checking. And if they didn't feel that you had produced some deliverables, had reached some certain milestones at the minimum, they may terminate the grant and you may not get the rest of the money. So this has been a situation historically where the government expects you to do your part and they are going to monitor it and follow up. So there are a lot of reporting requirements. It might be that you could satisfy them with frequent online reporting with documents and updates of progress and so forth. And I would think that if you are making forward progress and you have positive results, you're probably going to be okay. But if you don't meet your reporting requirements on time, if you don't report what appears to be that you are making progress and reaching milestones, you could end up having to talk to somebody from the public agency and so forth. And so you are highly responsible. The grant, on the other hand, is a very simple thing to define. It's a monetary award to achieve some public purpose. Sometimes the grants themselves are fairly broad and flexible in scope of what they will cover. But when it comes down to the exact things that they want done, those will be spelled out very specifically. They will demand in the terms of the grant accountability. So there's a provision in there that ties in with the contractual aspects that says you're going to have to follow up and we want to know that these things are done. So it could be in an annual lump sum, but it might also likely be in installments. You will definitely have an annual reporting requirement. And certainly at the end of the grant term, which could be 1 year or 2 years, it could be something like that. It could be shorter, but generally it's an annual requirement. But you will certainly have reporting and information and feedback to provide to the government, probably through forms and online contact on a fairly regular basis. So those opportunities are not as plentiful as they used to be. This idea of a public versus private alignment with the government really is about how well does the public agency, for instance, work with the nonprofit sector versus how well do they work with the for-profit sector? Well, certainly public officials do have a general perception that the purposes of the nonprofits and the sector in general more closely align with the purpose of government. And certainly that's easy to understand because both are serving the public most of the time in some way, pursuing some area that is charity or something to help a disadvantaged group or to fix some problem or some challenge in society. So it's easy to understand why nonprofits could develop closer relationships with local government officials, not only at the federal level, but also in uh, local communities rather than what for-profit firms are able to do. On the other hand, uh, nonprofits in general are resource dependent. And if a nonprofit becomes too dependent on a government grant, for instance, um, they are really in a hard place because a government grant really depends a lot on how well the economy is doing, on budgetary matters, on the political winds and so forth. Um, and resource dependency can put you out of business. So you would be forced to also develop other revenue streams, even if they're earned income streams, which you would have to pay some taxable uh, income expense on, but even so, it would be a revenue stream to reduce your resource dependency on only relying on grants. So nonprofits always have to be careful of that. And then we also have this idea that there's probably more trust from government officials towards nonprofits. And once they've established a track record, a trusting relationship does build over time. This is a little bit different than having a trusting relationship with a for-profit organization. There's a lot less trust there, quite honestly, from government officials. And so nonprofits may actually be able to get a grant for a longer period of time, maybe, than a for-profit company might be able to get a contract to provide some services or something, just depending on context and what is going on at the time. And so we talk about some of the challenges of working with the government. Well, certainly the monitoring requirements, the reporting, and all of that takes time. And so you have to deal with the issues as they develop. When it comes to matching funds, some government grants have provisions that require the nonprofit to get a matching amount of money in order to cover part of the program costs. The details will be worked out down to the infinite decimal and so forth, and there'll be no mystery about how much and what percent you might have to pay of a certain amount of money to gain that certain amount of money. And government funds rarely will want to be directed at any kind of indirect cost, since, such as your administrative expense, your rent, or using them to finance another earned income event like fundraising or of some type. These funds and so forth generally are meant to be mission specific. So you would have to provide feedback that shows that the money is actually being spent on providing the goods and services. If it was a grant that you're agreeing to there, if it's matching funds, this will be the provision that you have to show that you are doing what you agreed to do, again, what the government asked you to do. The terms will be that they will be glad to give you these funds, but you have to show that you've actually done what they're asking. So they may hold up the payments. They may not cancel it completely once you initially are qualified, but you have to provide the other sources of funding in order to maintain the matching funds service that you've agreed to. So you do have to be careful that the terms of the contract doesn't change on you unilaterally, laterally right after approval or at some point during the time period. And they also will not allow you to spend the money on the cost of administering the grant or whatever might come up with that. And so very much the contracts, whether it's matching funds or an outright grant, are things that are performance-based and on renewal and continued payment of installments and so forth. So things are contingent upon meeting certain outcome goals. And so certainly a nonprofit grant could be terminated before the grant period ends if the government is not satisfied. So certainly nonprofits and the government have been working closely together with a mindset of let's help the public, let's serve the public good. And so here are just some ideas of what each side can do. to improve that relationship and so forth. The government, well, let's keep things simple for the applications. Let's standardize as much of this paperwork as possible for grants and matching funds and terms of contracts and so forth. Make it easy to provide feedback and so forth. Certainly it's a digital world and there's no reason why these mechanisms shouldn't be completely online and not even use the mail or anything like that. And the government ought to be collecting a proper amount of data that covers the sector quite well so that they really have good information on how nonprofits are doing in general and percentages of grant usage and all of that. And they ought to be able to provide this to see what is our real impact? Are we helping nonprofits or are we really not making much of a splash at all? The nonprofits, on the other hand, have to also do their share. They have to enter into those feedback mechanisms. They have to provide the feedback and enter into the process and keep with it and meet the deadlines and do what they say they're going to do. They also should offer comments and helpful suggestions on how to get things improved, how to make things more efficient, but they have to, at the minimum, participate. We also, as far as the nonprofit sector goes, would like to encourage foundations and private funders of nonprofits to accept these sort of standard formats for payments and so forth, and to follow the rules as well, as far as taxation and deductions go, and so forth. And then build your capacity so that if you do find that certain grants are out there and available to you, that you enter into the relationship knowing that you have the capacity to actually pull it off. So there are ways out there to seek this government support. First, identify those grant opportunities that are out there. Do internet searches. Check the right sector magazines and newsletters and so forth. But identify those grant opportunities and then in particular, seek out those suitable matches for a funding request and check and see which ones you think you could reasonably qualify for. Read those requests for proposals carefully to see if you qualify. They're called RFPs, requests for proposals. And what the government is saying with these documents, and you can find them online, is here's what we want. Can you meet our requirements or not? And you start the process. You can also evaluate those grant opportunities when you find them. Check the criteria carefully. Not only are you eligible, well, really, what are the conditions? Are there match requirements? Are there allowable costs of certain types that you can spend some of the money on? Or is it specific that you can meet what the purpose of their program is asking you to do? Is it mission aligned with your mission? And is the amount right? Can you really afford to do it? Is that amount of money something that will cover the cost of doing that sort of program? And then be diligent in submitting your forms and proposals and applications. Submit all the information that they're asking. Follow all those specific guidelines in the RFP. Collaborate whenever possible. And then it may be that you're asked for something as simple as a letter of endorsement. Well, go to the local community that you've been working with and get a letter of endorsement from the local chamber of commerce or some other organization and so forth. You should have something like this, testimonials and so forth, available. Finally, I'd like to close talking just a few comments about nonprofits in the policy arena. If nonprofits really want to hope to secure and continue with government funding, they have to be involved somewhat in the public policy process in these sorts of ways. They've got to maintain relationships with those persons or individuals who are leading various public agencies that are providing grants, that are involved in the types of public services and so forth and goods that you are doing, that have like interests. So you can build trusting relationships over time. And then you do maintain ongoing engagement with your local community and your constituencies, as well as these public agencies and officials. And then whenever possible, participate in the area of the nonprofit sector where you're operating. If there's an association that produces guidelines and so forth for your behavior or for transparency and assessment or accountability, whatever it is, join those organizations and represent carefully the interests of all of those who are doing the same sorts of things that you are. Okay, folks, that's all I wanted to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.